Scott Sloan Show back on 700 WLW. So, President Trump ditched a housing bill, and he was supposed to sign this thing to force a vote on his election bill, and Republicans are at deep, deep war with one another. This is what it sounds like when doves cry, mom and dad fighting. So the bills, you have the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, and that was designed to lower housing costs and boost supply. It's going to streamline environmental reviews and speed up construction. It was cutting a lot of red tape, which is awesome. The one questionable part was limiting corporate landlords because it's a very small percentage of ownership out there doing it. But the impetus here is to try and improve the life for housing, get more people housed. The SAVE Act is for voting. That requires proof of citizenship, in-person registration requirements, and voter roll purges, which we've often talked about. And so these two things are at odds with one another. To help make sense of it, from D.C. is Victoria Churchill. She's a political reporter, U.S. political reporter on Capitol Hill for the Daily Mail. And Victoria Churchill, welcome back. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me back, Scott.
Yeah, of course. Presumably your fourth went well. I'm sure you're spectating / covering stuff, but no fingers or toes blown off again this year. So congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a wonderful spectacle here in the nation's capital. I had a front row seat to this show over at the Kennedy Center, so we could see pretty much the whole National Mall. We were, right up against one of the barges where everything was coming off from. So, yeah, it was a great show, great view. Thankfully, where I was, we had, we could be in and out of air conditioning. So I think I fared a little bit better than the folks that were in and out of the National Mall. So I definitely lucked out with an invite to that party.
Those credentials pay dividends, don't they? I didn't spend a lot of time inside watching stuff. I just kind of flipped around and said, okay, checked it out. I don't know, this whole American state fair, it's just the whole thing seemed kind of lame. For our 250th, I would have hoped it was better, but it looked like, I don't know, it looked stupid.
I actually personally haven't been down to the state fair. I'm hoping to make it down this week. We are expecting a lot of crazy weather this week, so hopefully it works out. I've honestly seen mixed coverage. I think there's a lot of people, particularly in the mainstream media, that want to kind of bag on a lot of the things that are going on, but also there's been a lot of shutdowns or pauses of them even just letting people in through the mags and things like that, just because of all the crazy weather we've had. I mean, I think at one point it was like 112. So, you've got extreme heat on one end and also crazy thunderstorms and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, no question that doesn't, it's not appealing to staying out in weather like that in a tent. When it's 115 degrees outside, for sure. So, yeah, I think that, and it's the other thing. I was flipping around and saw mainstream coverage, and so anything they can do to make Trump look bad, that's going to happen for sure. So it's kind of hard to get a read on it. Anyway, so we've got the two bills going head-to-head. Trump cancels the signing of the Bipartisan Housing Act. This happened a while ago. Both chambers passed it, veto-proof margins. Looks like we're going to move forward on this thing, and now that's being held hostage. We have the Housing Act. It's up in the air as well. So, how did this whole thing escalate from a housing bill signing to a full-blown civil war? It seems like.
Well, so I was talking to lawmakers on Capitol Hill just before they went on their July 4th recess. Of course, they're off this week for the holiday, but the Senate was out a week before, which actually made a lot of the House members quite mad because they're like, there's no point in us passing anything because the Senate's gone. And, honestly, I think looking at an electoral map, the Senate fight is going to be kind of a more brutal one than the House, which, again, I think is interesting because there's quite a handful of vulnerable, particularly Republican incumbents that are trying to hold on to their seats. So, they need something to bring back home for wins that they want to deliver. And, at least my view on it is the House is sending things over to the Senate where it's getting locked up. Obviously, this has kind of been a constant on a number of different bills, even back from, for example, a lot of the funding for DHS and ICE and things like that. That was a hot topic. I think you and I might have even talked about it earlier in the year. But yeah, so there's definitely a lot of frustration within the GOP, particularly between the House and the Senate. I'm forgetting the direct quote now, but it's something like from the Republican side, it's like the Democrats are, like not my friends, but the Senate is my enemy or something like that. Just paraphrasing that line here. But I think it really goes to show what that sentiment is. But I was talking to a lot of particularly House Republicans just before they went on the break. And, a lot of them view the Save America Act as very important. But they also realize that they need, particularly in a lot of those swing districts, because Save America is at least in the media, it's become kind of a right-wing issue, which is interesting because if you look at polling, at least what Republicans say is that it's an 80-20 issue. And so, with things like that, the perception is always half the fight, honestly, is winning the media battle. But, particularly in a lot of these swing districts, people want to deliver on things like housing. They want to deliver on things like affordability, which, that's something that the president has had some quotes that aren't super favorable. And, I've definitely been taken out of context, just even out of the way that he said them. But, he did say those things, which I think kind of raises some eyebrows, both in D.C. and back in the States. But, again, particularly when you're trying to win over voters in November, right? Because right now you're just trying to win over your base to win your primary if you have one. But in November, you want those independents to come out. We have some polling at the Daily Mail that we ran last week where, voter enthusiasm is, I think kind of the overall synopsis that it was like lowest among independents, and that on a generic ballot, about 50% were favoring the Democrat with only 42% favoring the Republican, and that 8% independents, which Republicans would really need to get over the crest in a lot of these key races all around the country. Those independents don't want to turn out. And so that's, always all elections or turnout elections are decided by who turns out. But seeing that independent lack of enthusiasm for turnout could be some early warning signs for Republicans.
Right. So is this really about election integrity, a SAVE Act, or is it about who controls the GOP's agenda?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think even though there have been documented cases of fraud, even some of your more right-wing think tanks in D.C. will say those are few and far between. Yep. Now, I think things like cleaning up voter rolls, that's definitely a very real question. And, I know in Virginia, for example, a couple years ago, there was, and, I don't really know why it was even so contentious, right? But just like making sure you cleared your deceased off voter rolls within a timely fashion, that was contentious. And, it's things like that. Like, to me, those things are common sense. The voter ID thing, again, to me, I don't buy this argument that it's, disenfranchising certain groups. Right. But it was interesting that it was even like Senator Lisa Murkowski, for example, from Alaska, was on the Senate floor a couple weeks ago. And she was like, it's hard for people in Alaska to get their real IDs because of how spread out the state is and where all those state like DMVs are and stuff like that.
It actually hurts Trump voters in a lot of rural areas too. I mean, a lot of these things like those are core Trump voters there in rural areas that are getting punished for that.
Yeah, and so, that was a perspective I hadn't heard before. I thought that was interesting. I thought that was notable. But overall, I think it makes sense. And, again, I mean, for me, like I'm on a flight multiple times a week. And so, not a week, thankfully, but multiple times a month. And so, for me, like having a real ID was kind of a no-brainer. But I guess for people that don't live that kind of lifestyle, maybe it is more of a contention. But, overall, I think it makes sense. But, yeah, I mean, Republican hardliners don't want to do anything until the Save America Act is passed. And it's interesting because this is also something that the president himself has kind of flip-flopped on. Obviously, he's always wanted this passed, but he told Republicans that we're not willing to pass some of these procedural measures on the House floor to advance some of their other priorities. That, basically stop grandstanding and we want to actually advance some of these priorities, versus he himself didn't sign the housing bill. And so it kind of seems like he's talking out of both sides out of his mouth. Yeah. Which, I mean, again, I think overall he's doing a fairly good job, but I think it's important to call things out like that when you see him, call balls and strikes, as they say. But yeah, it's interesting because the hardliners, they say, well, I'm supporting this because I'm the Trumpiest. But then when Trump himself goes out and says, well, I really, really care about this, and everybody else in the conference says, well, I really, really care about this, but then it holds up everything else, you kind of got to ask, like, why is this happening? Is there a better way to get things done?
She is Victoria Churchill. She's a U.S. political reporter on Capitol Hill in D.C. for the Daily Mail, and talking about the internal struggle here. Some call it a civil war. It's probably not a civil war, but it makes good headlines. It's good clickbait, right? You have the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. So you got a Housing Act being held up with the SAVE Act, and Now the Speaker Johnson's trying to thread the needle between what Trump wants and what his conference wants. And so how does he navigate that?
Well, I think what we saw, particularly just before the break, is that Johnson and Trump are presenting a united front. Johnson was actually in Trump's box, or his little makeshift building that they set up on July 4th. Mm-hmm. So I think the two of them have a good relationship. I think I can say that a lot more confidently about Speaker Johnson than, for example, his counterpart on the Senate side, Soon and Barrasso and the like. I didn't see any of them in Trump's box. Maybe I missed it. Maybe they were there. But, Johnson was very visibly there right next to the president. So I think they have each other's ear. There's also reporting that's come out that when Trump came out with that Truth Social post, that, basically saying stop grandstanding on the House floor, that Johnson was right next to him. So it does really seem like those two get along. But I also think that's interesting to note, because that really goes back to the whole way that Congress was designed, right? Is that the House was meant to capture the whims of the people versus the Senate was meant to be more of an institution. And I think right now we're actually quite seeing that at play, which, I'm talking about July 4th and American founding. Mm-hmm. I think that's actually really integral to how the nation was founded and our government was set up, is that, that resistance and that pushback is coming in the Senate, which is meant to be more of an institution. And so, even though Trump campaigned with a lot of these senators that were elected, for example, in 2024, there's a contingent of those Senate Republicans that won, particularly some of them that are up this year, they won their seats when Trump lost the national race. And so they actually, I think, still have a bit of a mandate to actually not always go along with what Trump wants, versus the House. If they've been elected, particularly in a lot of these seats, they were elected in that Trump wave, in a Trump mold. And, again, I think that really just goes back to the founding design of the government here in D.C.
All right. Well, how vulnerable then are House Republicans reacting to being caught between Trump and their districts? There's a squeeze here, obviously, but as you said, they got to go back home at some point and campaign. If the perception is we don't win anything because everything is gridlocked right now or tied up in this battle, what's the takeaway? What do you tell your constituents?
Well, I think another thing that we've already seen is just the sheer number of retirements, even on the GOP side. A lot of lawmakers are seeking offices back home in their home states. As an aside to that, some of them have been not successful in some of these primaries, I think, because they're too tied to this gridlock in D.C. Because people go, well, we elected you to be in D.C. and you haven't done anything, so why would we trust you back home? But, of course, that's part of their message is, I want to get things done, so I want to get out of D.C. And, we've seen that across the country. We've seen that in South Carolina with a couple of House Republicans losing in the governor's primary. We've seen that, in Texas, for example, with Chip Roy. So lots of these big names, in South Carolina, we've got Nancy Mace, her political career is done, at least for the foreseeable future. It's very interesting how they're kind of messaging that. But those that are running for their current offices in November, again, they've got a hard sell. Between the gridlock, the Iran war doesn't play too favorably in a lot of these swing districts. It does in some, for example, probably in the most vulnerable district that I'm looking at, Virginia's 2nd district. That's one I've focused on quite a bit, but, that's actually home to a lot of military bases. So they're actually doing okay. But outside of that, it is a hard sell, I think, for Republicans on the campaign trail. And so they want to have these wins that they deliver. They need to get the turnout of the base. And so, not having these photo ops of, for example, Trump signing the housing bill, of course, it's just a moment in time, but that's something that they would have loved to have had to go back, particularly in some of these primaries. We've got a little bit of a lull in July for some of these primaries. I think there's only 1 week that has them, but in August and early September, it's full steam ahead. With some of those later primaries, that voter enthusiasm is going to be hard as well to capture, because it's August, people are thinking about going back to school and everything that they've got to line up, and then at the same time they have to turn around and within a matter of weeks sometimes. And again, I'm just looking at Virginia because it's my home state, right? We've got 45 days of early voting, So Virginia's got an August primary, and then you basically have a lull for a few weeks, and then people are voting again. So it's really interesting to see what is actually on the minds of voters if they go to the polls, or if they even go to the polls, which goes back to that enthusiasm gap that I was talking about a few minutes ago.
Well, I think, too, it's flipped in my sense. It the SAVE Act is more inside baseball, and people are like, okay, well, I need an idea. I got an idea. I don't care. But housing is something that affects all of us, right? And now there's a path to reduce maybe the cost of housing, all the gridlock, all the things, the problem with DOGE that we didn't get largely. That is all in here. That's a great thing to hang your hat on, and yet there's no movement on it whatsoever. That seems that would play better with not just Republican core voters, but I'm talking about across the broad spectrum with independents, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I was talking about a few minutes ago, that independent turnout is going to be critical. It always is, but in some of these states, particularly, independents actually outnumber voters of both parties, just to kind of speak to how important their turnout is. And, again, for a lot of these independents, I think those economic issues are what's going to drive them out to vote. I've been traveling across the states, and I've been primarily going to either Democrat or Republican events, so I actually don't think I've talked to too many independent voters. But even among some of these, party activist types, they want to talk about the economy. And so I think that's something that cuts across, all gender, demographic, socioeconomic lines, etc. And, if Republicans aren't at least presenting something that's a win, and of course they can go back and talk to them about the big, beautiful bill from last summer. But even that, again, I've talked to lawmakers that say we put too much stuff in. People don't really know what it does or is doing for them. And it's also hasn't been messaged as well because it's been the BBB, it's been the working families tax credit. So on the messaging front, I think Republicans have an uphill battle.
She is Victoria Churchill, U.S. political reporter on Capitol Hill in D.C. for the Daily Mail. Checking in. Good stuff, Victoria. I appreciate your contributions. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Scott.